Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast from Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, Professor Paul Rogers explores the key trends shaping our world. With war in the Middle East, Donald Trump's return to the White House, and a new Labour government in the UK, 2025 has brought dramatic political shifts. These come alongside rising climate urgencies, widening global inequality, and disruptive advances in AI and biotechnology. Recorded live at the 2025 festival, Professor Rogers draws on decades of expertise in international security to consider the challenges and opportunities that may define the second half of this turbulent decade.
I'm very, very happy to say that we've got Paul Rogers with us today, and he's going to be talking to us about the prediction, what's going to happen, hopefully it'll be good, for 2030. So please give a very, very warm welcome to Paul Rogers.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for coming today. Is the sound okay at the back? Everybody here? Great, good. When I was coming across to the sort of pavilion, I met Nigel Grizzard, who many of you will know is very well known locally for doing really good sort of takes around Bradford. I think he's doing a couple of tours today. And he said, I know you're on this morning, Paul, what are you talking about? I said, well, it's going to be called The World in 2030. He thought for a minute, wouldn't it be better to say the world at the end of 2025? We've got to get there first. And I can take his point. I woke up fairly early this morning, as one does, and caught the 5 a.m. bulletin on world service. And among the items was Trump very happy that he'd succeeded in the Supreme Court, which has a 6-3 majority, we might say in favor of him, to make it more difficult for lower judges to interfere with what Trump is doing. He also said that they were stopping their negotiations with Canada, very suddenly, almost overnight. And he mentioned also that if need be, he will bomb Iran again. There were also reports of a southern European heat wave likely today and tomorrow, possibly even what they call a heat dome. But there was also a report that the long-running, 20-year conflict between the DRC Congo and Rwanda, there may be a pause in the fighting, and that may be in the process of being negotiated. It's the start of a very long process, but it shows there are some good things happening as well as bad things. I want to try and cover this topic pretty broadly. I won't speak for longer than 40 minutes. And don't forget, anybody in the front who gets really restless at about 35 minutes, show it, and I'll shut up. You know what academics are like. They just like to talk and talk and talk. So I want to actually look in the usual broad themes, which brings the whole global thing together, of environment, economics, and security. But it's also worth remembering other factors which are very difficult to predict. Obviously, the possibility of another pandemic. Many people on the public health side feel we haven't really come to terms with how bad COVID was. Remember that it probably killed between 20 and 25 million people. Even now, it's not clear. And there's some of it still around. So there's that to worry about, to be concerned about. There's a whole progress of AI. There's a whole process of automatic weapons, and the whole process of the drone revolution. All these things are happening as well. I'll touch on them a little bit, but it's always worth bearing in mind these are the big factors which can change things really remarkably quickly. But let's look at those three, and I'll take them in that order of environment, economy, and security. And just a run through on the environment side, those of you, we've discussed this before, you'll recognize a lot of this, and I want to really talk very much about what is happening now and what the changes are. But just climate in perspective, the concern with the human environment increased a lot in the 1960s and not in the 1970s. Two remarkable American women scientists were in many ways at the base of this. One, I'm sure you will recall, Rachel Carson, at her extraordinary book, Silent String. Perhaps less well remembered, but equally significant, was Donella Meadows. And she was the lead author of Limits to Growth, which came out in 1971, 10 years after Carson's book. And that was the first book which put systematically on the idea that there might be limits to the impact of the human environment of increasing human activity. As it happened, that came out just before the Stockholm Environment Conference. That really was very significant because it was presenting the world in a global thing, and the humans could actually affect the entire global environment. And from then on, through protracted periods of over the decades, people came to realize more and more what was happening. It's curious, I taught environmental science over at Huddersfield Polytechnic earlier in my career, back in the 1970s, and came across some lecture notes a few years ago, which were all about what were called biogeochemical cycles. Most people have heard about the nitrogen cycle, but there are a lot of others as well. And one of those is the carbon cycle, because carbon dioxide and its related molecules does actually circulate in the atmosphere. And it mentioned right at the end that there was some possibility, and this is in 1972, of increases in carbon dioxide affecting the world's climate. So even then, more than 50 years ago, it had got as far as lecture notes at somebody in an FE college. Sorry, I had to say it's an HE college, sorry about that. But essentially, it was already permeating around teachers and the like myself. And I think we tend to remember sort of the more recent past. It's been going around a long time. Looked at now, I think there are several factors you have to bear in mind. One is there is overwhelming evidence now that it is not just climate change, it's the beginnings of climate breakdown, and it's getting more and more serious. And many of the climate scientists who've worked on this for many, many years were always a little bit reticent about speaking in public and saying what they really thought, because they really trained to try and reach a consensus. That's much less true now, and climate scientists are much more vocal in saying this is a huge problem, it's probably the security problem in the global system. And that, I think, is a very important thing. And we're also seeing, I think, much more knowledge at the general public level, particularly among younger people, that this is going to be the issue for the next few decades. And unless we get on top of it, it's going to get an extremely difficult world. There have been particular events which I think have sort of made this even more significant. And I'll point to three in the last 2 years. The first and the most recent is the huge set of fires north of Los Angeles back in January. Not many people died in that. It was only, I think, 30 people got killed. But it caused huge damage in a long area. Immediately, the beloved Donald Trump explained that this was all bad due to bad land management, had nothing to do with climate change. Not everybody believed him. And similarly, people who tried to say that the Valencia floods, right at the start of, what was it, it's October of last year, wasn't it? That too, some people said nothing to do with climate breakdown. The Valencia floods were quite astonishing, the way that cars were just sort of pushed around like toys. And it also killed a lot of people. Over 200 people died in that. Now, both of those were signals of what is to come. There was a heat dome which affected a British Columbia town 3 or 4 years ago, and that more or less burnt the town out, and that's an indicator again. Perhaps the most significant one, though, is one which did not occur in the global north. It occurred on what you might call the fringe of the global south, and that was what happened in the port of Derna in northern Libya back in September 23. So all of these in the last 2 years. What happened in Derna was that a huge flash storm up in the hills several kilometers to the south of the city, 100 kilometers south of the city, actually deposited a huge amount of rain very quickly, rather like it happened at Valencia, but this time in a very concentrated form. And there was one very large wadi, and much of it came down here, took 2 dams out basically in the middle, just to one side of the city, and then went right through the city. And basically, it was a wall of water which just took out everything. And if you see the photographs afterwards, it's astonishing. And something like, at the minimum, about 6,000 people were killed. We don't know the whole total. Some people reckon it's at least double that number in a matter of minutes. Now, that was an extraordinary event, reported briefly at the time, but its significance, again, not fully appreciated. But what it means is we're beginning to experience what climate scientists have said for years, that we're going to get more severe weather events, and they're going to be more severe. We always get these floods on occasions, terrible ones, but they are happening more commonly, and by and large, they're getting worse. And that's a clear indication of the beginnings of climate breakdown. On the other hand, though, I think we have to accept that we have 2 very big problems among many, 2 very big additions among many. One is the huge power of the lobbyists, particularly for the oil, gas, and coal companies. The so-called fossil carbon lobbies are extremely strong, very well funded, and very good at presenting what you might call counter-propaganda. And that just goes on and on and on. The other side of the coin, though, is many positive changes. What is required is rapid decarbonization of the way we live. And what we now know, and this is much more true even than 20 years ago, is it is much cheaper to do. In fact, in many areas, many forms of electricity generated from renewable energy means are essentially much cheaper than from coal, gas, or oil. And essentially that means that we can do it. In fact, we could just about do it in time even now, although time is getting very short. But that is one area, probably the biggest single security threat to the whole of humankind, which is still at a point where we can get over it and sort it out. But it's going to require very big changes, which we can perhaps discuss a little later on. So that really is just in a thumb scale where we are on the climate side. I think it was also worth saying that there's this huge difference in perception between many people in the global north and many in the global south. You find in many global south countries, particularly island states, places like Barbados, for example, are well ahead of the game in recognizing the problems they're going to face and the problems the whole world is going to face. And that is all to the good, but they do not have the kind of lobbying power of essentially, basically, a vested interest in the global north. And that we have to face and face down. But that has to be done, but the point is it is possible still just to do it successfully. Plenty to discuss already, I know, but let's just go on and look at the other things I wanted to touch on. Next, the economy. You probably noticed, in fact, one of the other things, it wasn't on the World Service News this morning, but it was on the BBC News at 6, was this wedding of somebody, a large-scale warehouse person, I gather, in Venice, which essentially was costing $35 million for one wedding. It's a 3-day affair, so it's going to be quite a bounty, but that was it. And that, in a nutshell, is an illustration of what is happening on the world economy. Essentially, we are seeing greater and greater divisions of wealth and relative poverty. Always use the term relative poverty. A report from the World Bank very recently, just I think it's the beginning of last week, pointed out that they reckoned that even now there was the best part of 1 billion people who were right on the edge of the sort of poverty precipice. That is changing extremely slowly. And at the same time, overall, there's a huge surge in wealth among relatively few people. The report in one of the newspapers this morning was that our present beloved government is having problems in its own ranks, and it's going to have a hole of about £4.5 billion, which it's got to sort out. I don't know the exact figure, so don't quote me on this, and I think rightly, if you take the richest 20 people in Britain, just the richest 20, they have wealth which exceeds together about 200 billion. It's that sort of level that is happening. And essentially the differences are broadly very large and they tend to widen. It partly explains, this extraordinary anomaly, why in Britain, which is a relatively wealthy country, do we even have things like food banks? Why do they even exist? Why have they increased in number right across the country in the last 10, 20 years? So those are just indicators of what is actually going really very badly wrong. Much of it, I think, most people will now recognize has to do with a change in economic management towards what is sometimes called neoliberalism is the most common term. It goes under different names. And it's a fairly clear economic system which does differ from the more traditional Keynesianism, which is very much more directed at a mixed economy, which we had for very many years, and still to some extent we have now. But neoliberalism, I think, is important because essentially it really came to the fore in the 1980s, essentially going right back to, many people would argue it goes back to many Victorian-style economic systems, but essentially more recently it goes back to the Chicago School in the Second World War and afterwards, and people like Milton Friedman and Hayek and others who basically believed that there's a better way of running economies than this sort of rather messy mixed economy system. And that came in, there was the Mont Pelerin conferences for about 1949, 50 onwards. And during the period from 1950 to 1975 or so, there was more and more thought given to the alternative of what was called the neoliberal system. What is it in essence? Well, it's a system which believes that competition is much more important than cooperation, that the root of successful economic growth must come right through from competition, unless anything else is really wasting your time. That means that you obviously have a tax system which is geared towards the more successful. so people are motivated to compete successfully. You have a deregulated financial system. You don't have huge amounts of red tape. You let people get on with it because they basically know best. You have to control labor. I mean labor in the sense of the working people, because essentially otherwise things can get very unbalanced, and you have trade unions even causing problems at times. Privatization is very significant and very important. You should not have major state assets. The system works best when it's fully privatized. And basically you go for small government, not huge government sort of bureaucracies, but that does not mean government which are in any case less powerful. If anything small and powerful is the answer. Put that all together and you get a system which will really run very well. You will get losers. In fact, you have to have losers. But essentially, the so-called trickle-down theory is enough wealth will spread out to keep people satisfied so that you won't get major revolts. But if there are major revolts, you do have to be ready for them, obviously. Now, that again is a very quick run through it. I'm sure many people will recognize it. But the issue is that that came in very strongly at the end of the 1970s. In fact, it started with the huge increase in oil prices in 1973-74. And always remember that those prices were quite exceptional. Just in the space of October 73 to May 74, the price of oil overall went up by an average of 400%, just in the space of, 7 or 8 months. And that led to the stagflation of the middle 1970s, a combination of inflation and economic stagnation. And by the end of the 1970s, there was a change coming through with Thatcherism, Reaganomics and the rest, through into the 1980s. You got a huge boost at the end of the 1980s, of course, with the collapse of one of the alternative systems, the more centrally planned system as practiced in the Soviet Union. China went a rather different way. In fact, it combined the two in some ways, but that too has gone its own way with a very strong market element. Since then, you've had these changes. In fact, overall, there's been rather less economic growth than there was in the previous 40 years. Now, except to even discuss terms like economic growth, should we have economic growth? That phrase is probably beyond what we can discuss this morning, but I take it as read that there are big questions about that as well. So essentially, I think with that whole system, it is there, and it is proving very difficult for any of the major political parties to even think of changing it. It's interesting, in fact, that probably the only occasion, at least in British politics, when a manifesto was put forward, which was not revolutionary, but actually went for a series of reforms which amounted to quite a big change, was actually the Labour one of 2017. And that came fairly close to a breakthrough, but it didn't last, but it was there. I'd advise you to read that again. In fact, my wife keeps one in the kitchen at all times for visitors, because it's a very interesting document. It's an attempt by people, led I think largely by John MacDonald and some of the people around him, to set a kind of change which would actually be singularly different for a country like Britain, and maybe for other countries as well. New Labour under Tony Blair did not really espouse it, and I don't know what they call the current Labour, but it's under Keir Starmer. That doesn't seem to be espoused, although you see the problems within the party at present about the real concern, and it's clearly in far more backbenchers than people realise who are actually concerned about these practical differences which are emerging. And that, I think, is again a very interesting sign for things which may be changing. But let's go on to the third one, a little bit more briefly. I've just got to watch the time on this, and that is on the security side. Wow. Firstly, let's just look at the way security systems work. And then I think we've got to touch on Gaza and Ukraine and what lessons are to be learned from that. Although right at the start, one should say, and it's reflected in the program that Seaman and the others have put together, don't forget the huge conflicts that we've had in places like South Sudan and now Sudan itself, which are grievous conflicts by enemy. And this is why, in a way, what I said earlier on about that report of a possibility of the beginnings of a pause in fighting in DRC, Congo, is incredibly good news if it can get anywhere. There's a big if there, but at least it's a start, and I think we have to hang on to that sort of thing. I think the issue on the military side is that every country that has reasonably sizable armed forces or reasonable large defense industries will have what Eisenhower popularized as a term, military-industrial complex. And remember, Eisenhower was a two-term Republican president in the 1950s, and he was also the supreme Allied commander in Western Europe at the end of the Second World War. So he was a military person, and he was concerned about the way in which these entities, these complexes, seem to have a lot of power of their own. And he made a real point about you have to have democratic knowledge about what's going on and serious discussions. How military government industrial complexes work, I've been very lucky because over my career I've been able to do a lot of lecturing at defense colleges. People at defense colleges are interested in a wide range of views, and essentially you can talk things through in a way that you wouldn't normally expect you can do. But it does give me a sort of an idea very much about how the whole system works. And if you take the idea of a military industrial complex, we'll obviously have the military themselves, professional soldiers and the rest, who see their job as protecting the realm in the case of Britain. They're basically there to make sure that the country itself does not face violent security threats. And that is their job, full stop. Obviously, you have the civil servants who support them, and you have the defense industry as well. So you have the military themselves, the defense industries, and the civil servants in the Ministry of Defense and elsewhere. You also have, obviously, the intelligence agencies, the security and intelligence agencies. You have universities. Many universities actually get a lot of money from military sources. And you do get unions as well, who are very much involved in protecting their members. All of these, in many ways, interact in all kinds of ways. The decision-taking and the decision-forming is very unbalanced towards men. And in fact, this is something which people don't often recognize. So there is a kind of maleness to it all, and it is very much centered in essentially controlling things rather than going deeper down and understanding the causes, which is not considered to be the job. Let's face it, for most people in the military, their job is to defend the realm, not work out how and why it needs defending in the first place. That's the reality. It shouldn't be, but that is the reality. And that is true, I think, right across the board. I use the term glibly, military-industrial complex, and apply it to Britain, but I'm not just applying it to Britain. Any significantly large country will have the equivalent. Certainly, and some countries that may have been neutral or may still be neutral have them. Switzerland and Sweden both produce a lot of weapons, really seriously large numbers, and they have their own military-industrial complexes. It's the same with France, with Germany, with Russia, with India, with China, with the United States, with Canada, with Brazil, and many others. They all exist, and they have a purpose, which many people say is the obvious purpose, but the point is they approach security from what you might call a hard-headed basis. I've long used the term lidism, and the job basically is to keep the lid on problems rather than go underneath and work out what the problems are and how you turn the heat down. I had one quick anecdote. I had an experience, I'm sorry if any of you heard this before, about 7 or 8 years ago. I got an email out of the blue, could I go and lead on a seminar on world security down to an Oxford college? It's for a group of people from government. And they had a whole string of real experts, because what they were planning was to do a day on, threats and potential threats to Britain from weak and failing states. A lot of them around 7 or 8 years ago, and there still are now. And the idea was to work out why you had this problem and how to get over it. So they wanted somebody just to do an overview, a little bit like what we're doing this morning. So I said yes. So I went down, had a couple of nights down there, but it turned out that the audience was the commandant and all the senior officers of the SAS, supported by the Special Boat Service and MI6. Now, there was 30 people right at the core of special force work in the British government. And essentially, that was their job. The job was to look ahead. What are going to be the problems? I did actually try to discuss the probability that if you're looking at weak and failing states, then for heaven's sake, if you really want to help sort that problem out, don't allow climate to change, because that is going to lead to all sorts of problems in what are already weak states. I talked about it, but I just didn't get much for hearing, because this is not their function. And I think it's really very important to recognize that. So that is a general thing we're in. We're in a further problem at the moment because we've suddenly gone back, for reasons which are actually very difficult to explain, into a kind of new era of arms races. And this is extraordinary. Military spending is going up by leaps and bounds. Now, you can understand this to some extent. You take the figures for what happened with the Ukraine war. In the first 18 months after the Ukraine war broke out, BAE Systems, the largest British arms company, although it's multinational, obviously, its share price went up by 60%. In the case of Saab, which is a very big Swedish company, went up by 100%. And in the case of Rheinmetall, which is the big German company, makes tanks and the rest, went up by 200%. There was a further spurge, smaller but there, at the start of the Gaza war. And essentially, right across the board, if you want to be pretty sure you're going to get good investment, go into defense. Or if you like, go into military. I mean, it's always called defense, but an awful lot of it's attack, obviously. The point about this is that this is happening, and if you look at those two conflicts, again, there's no way we can look at them in detail, but I'll just say a little bit about each one. In the case of Ukraine, now almost 3 years on, the one thing to recognize is this is a conflict which cannot easily end except at the negotiating table, because in some ways neither side can win and neither side can lose. So, for example, if Ukraine was really facing difficulty with Russia, as it has done but seems to be doing rather more effectively less now, then it would always have more supplies coming in from NATO, because NATO cannot afford Ukraine to fail. But on the Russian side, if Russia feels under very heavy threat, well, Putin has already said, we may have to go to at least demonstration shots of nuclear devices just to show we really mean business. And so there you have a conflict which is going to have to end in some way in a negotiated settlement. And whether that will happen, who can say? As far as Ukraine is concerned, we're in an extremely difficult position there. And again, this opens up a whole can of worms. The position as of now is that it is very clear-cut that Iran will not be allowed under any circumstances to go further at even trying to consider developing nuclear weapons. Yes, Israel may have 90 or 100 warheads of all sorts, atom bombs, H-bombs, probably neutron bombs as well, but essentially Iran is not going to be allowed that. And that is basically won't be under international law. The United States and Israel would decide to do that. That's a very major step in wars. I'm not saying it's not happened before in different ways, but it's fundamentally something which is very significant. When we look at that now, I think we have a further problem, and this, I think, is the thing that is very, really worrying the people behind the scenes, and that is that Netanyahu, whether you agree with him or not, can do what he wants. He's basically impervious to criticism, and essentially, as long as Trump backs him, he can basically he can act with complete freedom. And that makes for considerable difficulty both in Gaza and, I say this because I've spent a fair bit of time there, the occupied West Bank, where what is happening is not as bad as Gaza, but is steadily going downhill almost day by day. And there is no major government which is really going to put a stop to this. So that, I think, is the most difficult of all. But we have to recognize that is happening, and it's really an indication of the kinds of wars, particularly when you get countries less prepared to look essentially the accepted norms of international behavior. And that, I think, is changing, and that is probably changing even compared with how one might have a discussion on this just a year ago. It's really pretty sudden. What about connections? Well, the three general themes of security, environment, and economy, they link in many different ways. So, for example, if you have a world in which you have really poor distribution of wealth, and large parts of the world really pretty close to the margins, as billions of people are, then obviously if you get a climate factor such as a real problem with harvesting food on a large global scale, as we could well be getting and may already be starting, then the two combine because it's the mass of people who are more likely to suffer. And that is a sort of very strong interconnection. It's also true that at the moment, most migration is more down to broad economic factors and also people trying to escape war zones. But that is causing huge problems, and it makes it very easy for certain politicians, broadly but not entirely on the political right, to say we cannot have migration. We've got to put a stop to this. We have, in other words, to close the castle gates. And that, I think, will get worse as the effects of climate change come in. There was an estimate done, admittedly, this is 20 years ago, by a research group down at Oxford University, which reckoned that on the trends that they could see ahead in terms of changes in the climate, they expected the number of people essentially needing, I say that strongly, needing to move would probably increase tenfold, certainly well before the end of this century. In other words, there are going to be mass pressures on migration, and those will be resisted. And politicians will be very good at saying this is a huge danger. You don't look at the nature of the problem. You don't look at why people need to move, but essentially you have to protect yourselves. And that works against all the tenets of the United Nations and the rest. I think essentially the whole phenomenon of closing the castle gates, which is a crude way of putting it, is the real issue that we have to face. And remember that if 9/11 showed you one thing, it showed you that you cannot close the castle gates, particularly in an integrated world. But that really does not look good. You're looking for quick answers. Overall, I think the problem is that there'll be a need to sort of control and protect societies and make sure that societies are working for the benefit of the society themselves within the societies themselves, which means that in many countries you will see a much greater antagonism to the idea of public protest, because public protest is tending to upset the apple cart. We've got problems, we're governments with big problems, but we do not want people actually using something like direct action to prevent what we think is necessary happening. You're seeing that very clearly in Britain with the changes in the law, which I think are coming in today or very soon, on the nature of protests and how you can prescribe particular groups. And the prescription is expanding more and more. That obviously at the moment is concerned with the terrible conflict in Gaza, but it can move around as well. So in other words, an elite group which believes it is governing in its own interest, but in the interest of everybody, is worried when in fact, in a sense, it feels that things are getting slightly out of hand. I think there's a very strong suspicion that the current government and its immediate predecessor have got really concerned about the sheer size of the demonstrations you've seen in London on, broadly speaking, the Gaza issue. Over the last few years, few months, you've seen it basically demonstration after demonstration with hundreds of thousands of people gathering. And that is not something you've seen in Britain for a long time, not even at the start of the Iraq War. You had to go right back to Aldermaston and the rest before you could see that. And it's interesting, I think there's real concern on the part of government that as the decision has been taken to put more resources into the British nuclear program, at the same time making sure it's much more secret so we don't know exactly what's happening, again, they are fearful that there may be an occasion in which you're going to get these groups all amalgamating together. I should say, and this is maybe slightly jocular, I inherited by roundabout means, but legitimately, 3 large pieces of the Green and Common fence, basically because they come up to the Bradford Museum's department for the Peace Museum, but they're far too big for that, so they're going to get rid of them. And we got a small holding, so we say, well, we'll have it. And what's rather nice is the 2 smaller rolls form the basis of the current exhibition at the Peace Museum. So they are the original Green and Common fence. Now, if you think, well, so you're going to get more Green and Common fences type happening and people wanted to get over them, should I donate my 30 meters of Green and Common for a test for people to practice on? Should I? But you see, by saying that in public and you saying yes, we're now guilty of a major conspiracy. So this is, at least we've got to have a bit of humour somewhere, haven't we? So anyway, it's there, we will see. Let me try and bring this to an end so we've got the time for questions. I've quoted before, I hope you don't mind if I quote again, that extraordinary sentence from Edwin Brooks, that remarkable economic geographer, writing and working 30, 40, 50 years ago. This one comes from 1972, and he said, what we've got to avoid is a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate men in the global ghettos of the underprivileged. Tease out a little bit of that. He used the term men. That is mainly because of the nature of the gendered times. Anybody saying that now would not say men. They'd recognize this as a much wider thing. You've only got to look at what happened in the miners' strike to remember that for a start. Also, the use of the term privilege. That's not a very commonly used term. It's a very good term. When you think about the nature of privilege, it really brings a lot of different things together at the same time. And I think, in a sense, that also helps us. Where do we come with all of this? Are we going to get through it? I think yes, but I think if you look back, there are some areas where you can be genuinely hopeful. One is, as I've said, and I've rather belabored it, the whole issue of climate breakdown and what can be done, and done very quickly. We've got a very powerful lobby against doing it, but it is possible to do it, and more and people are prepared to do it. And in fact, the changeover to solar and wind power worldwide is extraordinarily rapid at present. We've got Trump and the likes of him who are against it, but even he has a problem. You know, when the Texas people who own lots of land in Texas are saying, look, we want wind farms, we can make money out of them. And that is actually a problem in some parts of Texas at the present time among key Trump supporters. And they're stuck on this. That, I think, is a huge issue worldwide, but it can be done, and that depends very much on what many people try to do in many different ways. On the economic side, well, it's also worth remembering there isn't just one economic model around. Across the global south, for example, there are estimated to be just under 1 billion people who are members of cooperatives. And the cooperative system is much more widely used in other countries. And I mean, look at Mondragon in northern Spain, extraordinary big conglomerate, which is actually a cooperative and has a very good reputation for what it does. So there are other methods. There are also a lot of good work being done by the likes of the New Economics Foundation, that beautifully named Donut Economics, which I don't fully understand, but it looks very good, and many other examples. We do know that basically economies can be altered. And this is why go back and look at that 2017 manifesto, because it indicated ways in which we're starting to move in another direction. Not revolutionary, not sort of a complete turnover in the space of a year or so, but progressive and accelerating. It can be done if more and more people are convinced that they can help do it. On the military side, well, I have to say that is probably the most difficult at the moment, because just at the moment we're flush with this almost desire to make sure that everybody is better and better armed, and when one group needs to be better armed, another group feels it's got to match it. And it goes on and on and on, and you get arms races within arms races. If you look back on it, I mean, the idea that Russia is going to threaten Britain, and I mean, it's been indicated to us that we actually may have forces, foreign forces, fighting on our soil. And that's implied in some of the comments from government in the last week or two. Where are we? I mean, Russia has been depending on support from Iran and North Korea. It would be an impossible position if it tried to expand in any way what it has already done. And remember that Russia is not this huge economic giant. Russia has a GDP which is only slightly bigger than that of Britain and decidedly less than that of Germany, and a fraction of that of the United States, or indeed China, and certainly of NATO as well. In other words, the idea that this is the coming threat, the danger, of course, is it has nuclear weapons, and that is another problem which is basically coming back, because now we're going back into an enhanced nuclear age. That to me, and okay, I've worked in this field for years, is probably the biggest single sudden worry and change in the last year, particularly since Trump got back in. That may well lead, though, to a much more invigorated anti-nuclear movement in Britain and other countries, which I think is going to be very badly needed. But I have to say that of those three general areas, economy, environment, and security, I think security is the most difficult one in the coming years. But that does not mean we don't work at it to make sure that these things do not happen. And this essentially is down to all of us in many different ways. And if we can really start to turn things around and always say there are other possibilities, and if we don't take them, then we really are in a mess, you have to sort of balance the reality that things could get very bad by 2030 with the possibility that we can start turning it around within those years. So, all right, the worst case is even worse, more problems with Trump and the rest, climate change getting worse and worse in the next 5 years. The better chance, and it is there because we know it is possible, is to start turning it around. And that, I think, is very much up to all of us in many different ways to do what we can. But what you have to remember is these are big global issues. We have to face up to them. Too many people aren't. But if more people do face up to them and are prepared to work in any way they can individually, then we have a chance, a good chance, that our grandchildren and children and grandchildren may see a better future. It's certainly worth working for. And so this is why I think, it's a thing we all have to do. Let me tell you at that point, let's have some questions and discussion. I'm sorry, I got a bit carried away there and went on longer than expected. You should have been shuffling around in the front and I would have stopped earlier. Who would like to start? Comments or questions? But can you keep them pretty brief because we may have a few. Who would like to, please? Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very informative chat. I think most people would agree here. You touched briefly on AI, but not a lot. And I just wondered if you have a world where anyone could create anything about any subject and anyone could publish that without virtually any restriction. What sort of world do you anticipate we'd have in 2030?
I'm not sure that I'm equipped to answer that. When you look at what some of the AI specialists are saying, there is something of a common theme that these risks of AI are being grossly exaggerated. That in fact there are all sorts of ways in which it becomes very difficult to do precisely what you're saying. I'm not so sure about that, because when you see the effect of influencers, which we're seeing now, then it's clear there's a huge capacity to point human behavior in particular directions. But I don't think I could answer that, except that, the people who are in AI who recognize this issue, there's a very good professor, I can't remember her name, I'm afraid, in one of the Canadian universities, who has a world reputation for basically pouring scorn on much of what is claimed for AI. And people are listening to her. There was a full-scale profile of her in the Financial Times last weekend. So there are other voices on this, but in terms of what effect that would have, it could be dire. You can't predict what way it would go, and that, I suppose, is the worry, because when push comes to shove, most of these new developments are driven, partly at least, by the desire to make profits, and that is when basically regulations, if they don't go out the window, they're very much weakened. Please.
Do you believe that Putin's intentions are mainly expansive or defensive?
The curious thing is it's a mixture of both, because if you go, you have to start back in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia embraced what people called at the time hypercapitalism, and essentially it was an utter disaster. By the latter part of the 1990s, about 1/3 of all people in Russia were below the poverty line. In fact, the entire life expectancy went down by about 5 years, even more for men than for women because of alcoholism. And so really Russia had an incredibly difficult time, and in many ways it was treated with contempt by Western countries. This was a failed state, the great Russia gone. And I think the problem was that even now is bitterly resented, but more particularly, Putin was able to use that right from when he came to power in 2000 as a vehicle for saying we can make ourselves great again. It's difficult to define exactly what Putin is about, because you do have this whole thing within Russian thinking, going right back to the white Russians, of how important Russia is for the world, that it is a natural leader of the world. Putin probably hangs on to that to some extent, but also I think he is very much concerned with the nature of power and how you use it. So overall, I would say that Putin is somebody who, when push comes to shove, business can be done with, but not easily. But the reality is, and probably he is told this, he may not always hear it, that the reality is that if there was any kind of major conflict with the Western countries, not just Ukraine, aided by it, but more generally, Russia would come out of it very badly, and that also is when we would be in a huge danger of escalation to nuclear weapons. So I think the probability is that Putin can be brought to book in that sense, but the real worry is the nature of the relationship between him and Trump, because essentially we do not know where Trump is coming from. Are they basically two oligarchs who basically see the means of power from very different perspectives, and that's what it's basically about. And one has to remember the development of oligarchies as a whole. We've always had those. Some of us will probably remember Sir Bernard and Lady Docker from 40, 50 years ago. Those were the very wealthy people of the days. We've always had situations like that. We have more of it now. It's more extreme. But the reality, therefore, is that it may well be that you look at Trump and, to an extent, Putin in terms of the power of wealth. And that is a personal motive, I think, which is probably less recognized in Putin's case than it is in Trump's. Not sure that helps much, but it just adds a little bit in terms of thoughts. Yes, who would like to go next?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that in the early 70s, there was an episode where the oil prices just shot up, and that caused a lot of problems. What was the cause of that?
It's a very interesting cause. At the time, there was OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC had been around for about 10 or 11 years, not very successful. It never got people together sufficiently. But in 1973, you had the outbreak in October of the Yom Kippur Ramadan War. And that was the one in which Israel initiated it to try and get back the problems that it experienced earlier on. And essentially, in its determination to do so, I got this wrong. 1973, forget that bit. That was the one in which Israel was attacked by surprise by Egypt and Syria. And that was in response to the Six-Day War, where those countries actually experienced huge loss of land and the rest. So essentially, at that time, Israel seemed to be under heavy pressure, but within 3 or 4 days of the start of the war, it was able to take the upper hand. And in fact, at one stage, the Egyptian Third Army was under huge pressure, and it looked like Israel might actually win that war. And that was when the Arab members of OPEC, a group called OAPEC, actually got together and did two things. They erected an embargo on all oil sales to the United States and to the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? Key entry point for a hell of a lot of oil into Europe via tanker. That's the first thing. They also announced that out of the blue, without any negotiation, completely unilaterally, they would put the price of oil up by 70%. And it worked. And in fact, although we don't know the full story because there were other pressures on the United States, the whole idea was to pressurize the United States to tell Israel to go for a ceasefire. It seemed to work, but there were probably other factors as well the United States was worried about. But that set in motion a huge range. In fact, Financial Times on, I think it was Christmas Eve of 1973, it's the only paper headlined with prices to go up by another 100%. Because the OPEC group now realized it had a situation of what was called producer power, which it had not had before, and it was going to use it. So a combination of that and a lot of other prices meant 400% overall. And it was a rare example of the use of producer power, which has not normally worked. Commodity producers have never been sufficiently unified for it to work elsewhere, but it worked at that time and had a very big impact on the world. So in some ways, it's worth reading up on that because very few people nowadays realize where it came from.
Hello, you haven't mentioned the rule of law to regulate ourselves or keep ourselves accountable. Is that because you believe it's mute?
I think the rule of war in general terms is in serious trouble. And I think in many ways, it's one of the areas we had to work on much more. You see, what is happening now in a more disparate world with a relatively weak United Nations, remember the United Nations' strength depends on its entire membership. You have many systems in which you have laws which people should follow, but are not following. And essentially, if you have the International Criminal Court, which goes for individuals, a few are still in jail for that. If you go for the International Court of Justice, which looks at where countries behave, then obviously that is also happening on occasions. The South African attempt to get it in front of the situation in Gaza, in front of the International Court of Justice. But the trouble is, going right across the areas of international law, it is in trouble at the present time. And that is partly down to individual countries believing that it is in their own interests not to cooperate at all with others, but to go their own way. Now, again, it's a huge subject which we could probably spend half an afternoon on. I'd like to hear some real experts in it discuss it. That's what I understand the position is, that essentially, if you were following the international laws of war, then, I mean, for a start, a lot of the things which Russia has done would be outlawed. Most of the things that that Netanyahu has done would be outlawed. I mean, look at what extraordinary things that are happening in Gaza at the present time. It's straightforward murder on a large scale. And there's no doubt at all that that should be dealt with under a legal system. Many people argued that, we should look at recent conflicts on that. I remember contributing to a small group of academics who said, after 9/11, do not go to war with the Taliban. Don't do it, because you'll end up with a war which will last a long time. Actually, it lasted 20 years, and the Taliban came back at the end of it. The argument was, take the rule-based order and bring them to justice, however long it takes, through a legal system, because they want you to go to war with them. And it's that thinking, I think, it's a minority thinking, but I think it's the right thinking. But essentially, what I would love to see is any government, and not least the British government, which does actually have quite a competent diplomatic corps, putting much more effort into supporting the organs of the UN which are concerned with international law, and doing that in a way with other countries so to rebuild the idea that following international law is essential, and if you don't do it, then essentially it could be up in court. But again, it's a huge task which we have to bear in mind is not going to be easy to come through. I think there's one at the front here, wasn't there? Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very informative. I do suspect you might be preaching to the converted in this room. How do we get the information that you have just been talking about to the vast swathes of people, it feels like, who are listening to other messages?
Well, you do your best in your own way. I mean, anybody can sort of get the kind of material which I've just been going through this afternoon. It's readily available. And then you have to look at, how best to get it across. In some ways, you see the change in what is happening in attitudes to the war in Gaza is a reflection of the work and the campaigning of many people over the last 15 or 18 months. And that has signaled a change. I'd also point out that people tend to forget that just before the Iraq war started in 2003, there was the biggest single demonstration ever seen in Britain in terms of the numbers involved. And people said afterwards, well, it didn't work. They went to war after, didn't they? Yes, but 3 years later in 2006, there was a very strong chance that George Bush was going to go for Iran and Britain would be involved. And that came to nothing. And the suspicion is that countries, including countries like Britain, knew that if they went for another war in the Middle East after the failures in Iraq, then they would be on a hiding to nothing themselves. And I think the impact of all that campaigning on Iraq probably made it less likely that there would be a war in Iran 3 years later. So it's worth remembering that. But beyond that, I mean, you just have to work in all ways you can. One thing I did have to say just at the end is, just by chance, there's this little book which I wrote fairly recently called The Insecurity Trap, which, with help from Judith Large, who is really good, she does a lot of work on community mediation, just trying to say what the problems are and what the solutions are. The only thing is, of course, it is pre-Trump. It was written towards the end of last year. We're doing an update now. But if you're interested, there is a signing just now after this event. So thanks for asking that question. We've got time for a couple more questions. Anybody got one?
Hi. Yeah, sorry to leave it late, but can I ask you the can of worms question about the Middle East? How do you see it playing out? Do you see anyone as being the honest broker to foment a peace between Israel and, shall we say, Gaza and the organizations that are there? Can you see the Arab states don't seem to be keen to help the Palestinians? They're arm's length, and they traditionally have been, except for Jordan. Can you see any way forward there?
Not easily, unless Trump basically changes his mind or has his mind altered. The reality is that, the 7th of October was a huge shock to the average Israeli. It might have been the 5th of the wars in Gaza, with many Palestinians killed before that, but this time it was Israeli Jews getting killed, over 1,000 of them killed. And that is very small compared with what happened to the Palestinians, but from an Israeli perspective, they believed that it was absolutely appalling and meant that the country was insecure. It's that phrase that is sometimes used, that Israel uniquely is, impregnable in its insecurity. It's fundamentally insecure, therefore it has to feel impregnable. And this is, I think, the real difficulty you face. It may be that pressure ends up on Netanyahu, because what is happening in Gaza is absolutely appalling. And the reality is that, Israeli Jews and Jews in many parts of the world are actually less secure now than at the start of the war by what Netanyahu's done. You're getting whole generations of very angry young people, and not just men on the Palestinian side, and that is going to have an effect over the generations. But it's difficult to say. But do remember, there are many Jews, I have some friends who are bitterly opposed to what Netanyahu is doing. But essentially, their voice is not getting through in Israel itself yet. It's a rambling answer, and the answer is I do not know what the better way is, but essentially all you can do is put as much pressure as you can and campaign as much as you can to add to what is already being done. Sorry, it's not a better, easier answer than that. Okay? Right, well, look, thanks so much for listening to me. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast with Bradford Literature Festival. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share this episode with others and leave a rating. Mark your calendars for the return of Bradford Literature Festival Friday the 3rd to Sunday the 12th of July 2026.